Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, when you sent in this request to explore Brown v. Board of Education, I knew it was a landmark case. But diving into these sources, it's been really eye-opening. It's way more than a history lesson, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Yeah, it gets to so many issues that we're still dealing with today, equality, justice, and how ordinary people can challenge really deeply entrenched systems.
Okay, so let's unpack this. You provided some incredible material about segregated schools in the 1950s. I mean, it's hard to believe,
Right.
17 states, including Kansas, it was perfectly legal to separate kids based on race.
And this wasn't that long ago, right? This is only like 70 years ago. The separate but equal doctrine from Plessy v. Ferguson was still the law.
Right, and that's where Oliver Brown comes in. Imagine, being told your daughter can't attend the school that's 5 blocks from your home because she's black, and instead she has to walk 20 blocks, crossing dangerous railroad tracks just to get to her assigned school. It's infuriating.
It really highlights the reality of segregation back then. And the NAACP, with Thurgood Marshall, they saw this Brown's case as the perfect way to directly challenge Plessy.
And they picked Kansas strategically, didn't they? It's not like they started in Mississippi or something.
Exactly. Their legal strategy was brilliant. They knew that a case from a state that didn't have that wasn't as openly hostile towards different races, a border state like Kansas, might be looked at more favorably by the Supreme Court.
So it was about picking the right battleground to fight segregation across the country.
Precisely. They'd already won some important cases, slowly chipping away at separate but equal. Cases like McLaurin v. Oklahoma State Regents, which focused on graduate schools, and Sweat v. Painter, that was about law schools.
So they were building their case, like brick by brick, to finally overturn Plessy.
Yes. And with Brown v. Board, they weren't just arguing about, unequal resources between black and white schools, which definitely existed. They went a step further. They argued against the whole idea that separate could ever really be equal.
And this is where Thurgood Marshall, he was a legal genius. This is where he really shines.
Yeah, definitely. Marshall, he knew to win this case, he had to show the psychological damage that segregation did to black children.
You're talking about that famous doll test, right? That was in your sources. Let me tell you, that was tough to reach.
It was a groundbreaking moment, legally. Imagine young black children, they're given 2 dolls, a black doll and a white doll. When asked which doll was prettier, smarter, nicer, most of them chose the white doll.
It's heartbreaking, but it's powerful evidence of how insidious segregation really was.
Right. It showed how segregation messed with how these kids saw themselves. It made them feel less than, This evidence was key to Marshall's argument. He said separate facilities were inherently unequal. It violated the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause.
So the stage is set. The case, it's fueled by Oliver Brown's courage and the NAACP's brilliant strategy. And it reaches the Supreme Court. What a moment.
The Supreme Court back then in '54, they'd seen some tough issues. But this case, Brown v. Board, this was huge. The whole country was watching.
Yeah, and leading the court was Chief Justice Earl Warren. From the sources you sent, Warren wasn't exactly a big supporter of civil rights when he first started, right?
Yeah, he wasn't really seen as a champion for social change. But what's interesting is how he stepped up. Warren knew that if the court wasn't united, it wouldn't have the moral weight to really end segregation.
He knew the country needed a clear message from the highest court.
Exactly. And he worked hard behind the scenes to get everybody to agree. He saw this case as defining, for the court, for the nation.
And on May 17th, 1954, the court gives its decision. They say separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. It's almost impossible to overstate how big this was.
Yeah, it sent shockwaves, through the whole country. Think about it. The Supreme Court just overturned something that had been in place for like 60 years. The legal basis for segregation was gone.
But as we all know, winning in court doesn't mean things change right away. You included some stuff about Brown II, about how to actually desegregate, and that's where things get really, really tricky.
That's right. In '55, the court, they issued Brown II. It said states had to desegregate with all deliberate speed. And that phrase, it sounds good, but it would actually become a big problem.
All deliberate speed. It sounds like a way to just delay things, doesn't it?
Yeah, it did. And a lot of states in the South, they used it as an excuse to just not integrate. They put up massive resistance.
Give me an example. What did this massive resistance look like? I mean, we're talking about court orders here.
So picture this. In Virginia, they had Prince Edward County. Instead of integrating, they closed down the whole public school system for 5 years. They took money meant for public schools and gave it to private, all-white schools. Black students, they had nowhere to go.
It's crazy how far they were willing to go to defy the Supreme Court.
And it wasn't just Virginia. All over the South, states tried all sorts of things to keep segregation going. They changed school district boundaries, integrated a tiny bit just to look like they were following the rules. They even used state troopers to block black kids from going into white schools.
You included the story of Ruby Bridges, that little 6-year-old girl who needed federal marshals just to go to elementary school in New Orleans. It's a really strong image that shows how intense this resistance was.
It does. These stories, they show the real human cost of segregation and how much courage it took to fight against it.
So Brown v. Board, it was a huge win legally, but the real fight for integration was just getting started. It reminds us that laws, they can't change people's hearts and minds just like that.
Exactly. It took a lot of pressure, people fighting from the ground up, and years of struggle to make desegregation happen. And even now, the fight for real equality in education, it's still going on today.
We've talked about the background, the court case, and how people resisted Brown v. Board. But what about its impact over time? What's its legacy, especially for us today?
It's important to realize that Brown v. Board wasn't only about schools. It was about dismantling this whole system of Jim Crow segregation, the segregation that was everywhere in America.
So it had effects way beyond the classroom.
Yeah, for sure. Think about it, Brown. It gave the legal basis for challenging segregation in all parts of public life.
Yeah.
Housing, transportation, voting, even access to parks and swimming pools.
Like Brown v. Board, it opened a door, and then other movements and court battles just rushed through.
That's a good way to put it. Brown v. Board, it really gave strength to the whole civil rights movement. It powered the fight for voting rights, fair housing, and equal opportunities for jobs.
And it set the stage for important laws, right? Like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Absolutely. Those big laws that made discrimination illegal based on race, color, religion, sex, or where you're from, they wouldn't have happened without Brown v. Board. The federal government finally started to actually enforce the constitutional rights of all citizens.
And it had a huge impact on culture, too, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, for sure. Brown v. Board, it started this national conversation about race inequality that we're still having today. It inspired generations of activists, from the freedom riders who challenged segregation on those interstate buses to the students who did those sit-ins at segregated lunch counters.
It became a symbol of hope, a guiding light for those fighting for justice and equality.
Exactly. And it's important to remember there are different ways to understand Brown v. Board, its place in history. You sent some sources that highlighted these different views, which I think is really, really valuable.
Let's talk about those different views. I mean, we've already seen this wasn't a simple story with a happy ending.
Right. You've got the traditionalists. They see Brown as a complete victory, a key turning point in the fight for civil rights. They focus on how morally clear it was, how legally brilliant it was.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yep.
And then there are, what do you call the legalists, right?
Yeah.
Or what's their take on it?
Legalists, they tend to focus on what Brown didn't do. They say, yeah, it was a huge ruling, but it didn't just magically make all that racism go away. They point to how slow desegregation was, especially in the South, and how segregation just continued in a lot of places, not because of laws, but just because of how things were.
So they're saying Brown was important, but it wasn't like a quick fix, right?
Yeah, exactly. They say we need to also address the underlying stuff, like the social and economic inequalities that make things unequal for different races and schools and everywhere else.
And you also mentioned the revisionist perspective, which often comes up with critical race theory. What are their main points?
Revisionists, they often say that Brown was mostly symbolic. They say, okay, it desegregated schools on paper, but real integration, that didn't really happen in a lot of places. They talk about how there are still big differences between races and education, and they argue Brown didn't really fix the root of the problem.
So they're pushing back on the idea that Brown was a total win, saying that real equality needs more than just changing the laws about segregation.
Yeah, exactly. They want us to really look at how racism and discrimination still affect things today, and how those things still shape who gets opportunities in education and what happens to them.
That's a really important point. And then there's the social historian perspective, which I find really interesting. What do they emphasize?
Social historians, they remind us that Brown v. Board wasn't just about lawyers and judges. It was about all those people, those everyday people who put themselves at risk to fight segregation. They talk about activists, parents, students, community organizers, all those folks who worked so hard to make things change.
So they're focusing on the human side of this story, the bravery and determination of the people who demanded justice.
Yeah, absolutely. Think about the Montgomery bus boycott, the freedom rides, the lunch counter sit-ins, all of that. It was inspired by what happened with Brown v. Board. It shows how powerful it can be when people work together, and how important it is to keep fighting, to be brave and never give up.
It's amazing how one Supreme Court case could start such a huge movement for social change.
Yeah, it really shows you how powerful ideas can be and how they can, spread and change things. Brown v. Board, it didn't just change laws, it changed how people thought and felt. It helped change how the whole country talked about race and equality, and it made it possible for things to get better in the future.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Brown v. Board of Education, what are the key things you hope our listener will take away from this?
It's a story about amazing legal strategy, incredible courage, and this ongoing fight for justice. It shows us that progress, it can be slow, it happens step by step, and we have to stay aware and keep working to dismantle systems that oppress people.
And it also shows how important it is to understand history from different points of view,
Yes.
to see all the complicated details and the things that shape how we see the past.
Right, exactly. Brown v. Board, it wasn't just a moment in time. It's a legacy. It's something that still affects us today. It makes us ask questions like what kinds of inequality are still out there? What can we learn from the people who fought before us, from their strategies and their sacrifices? And how can we work to create a world that's more just and equal for everybody?
Those are powerful questions, and I think this deep dive has given our listener a lot to think about. Brown v. Board reminds us that fighting for justice, it's a journey. It's not over, and it needs all of us to participate, to question, and to take action.
Well said. Yeah, the fight for equality, it never really ends. And Brown v. Board, it's a powerful example of what can happen when people stand up for what's right.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better world.
See you on the next deep dive.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.